Hello, this is Jacqueline from Jack Knits, and we're going to take a look at the Italian tubular cast-on. This unique cast-on method allows for a very invisible edge to your cast-on for your 1x1 ribbing. So if you see here, your ribbing just kind of falls off the edge, makes this loop around the edge and continues up the other side. There is no edge. For comparison here, I did a regular 1x1 swatch using the regular long tail cast on, and you can see that there is a definite edge to your ribbing here. See, the end has a very specific ridge. Here on this side you're seeing very specific loops of yarn, where on this you are not seeing anything. It just feels like that ribbing is coming out of nowhere. I'm almost comparing it to like an infinity pool, right? Where the water just flows over the edge. Well, in the same way, this ribbing just flows over the edge. So if you want a very professional, neat, precise looking edge to your ribbing, then this is the cast on you want to learn how to do. It does require a few extra steps, so we're going to walk through those steps. I'm going to show you how to do this in flat, knitted flat with straight needles, and also how to do it in the round. Very similar, just a few subtle differences that we will go through. So let's get started on how to do this cast on. The first thing that I want to mention with doing this Italian tubular cast on is that I would recommend doing the cast on and the first couple setup rows with a smaller size needle that you plan to do for the rest of your project. So for instance, if I am going to knit a hat that is using a US size 7 needle, I am going to use a US size 5 needle to do the cast on and a couple setup rows, and then I will switch to the larger needle. And this just allows, I feel, just a little tighter and a snugger, if that's a word, a snugger base to your cast on, and I just think it looks a little bit more professional. So we're going to, for this tutorial, start with a US size 5, a smaller needle, and we're going to first learn how to do this with knitting flat. So as with, this is very similar to the long tail cast on method, but just a little different method on looping on the stitches for your cast on. But similarly, it starts with a tail. So we're going to give ourselves a little tail here. And we're going to put our yarn in the same position that you do for a long tail. So I'm going to have my thumb and forefinger kind of produce this triangle, holding the rest of the yarn in here. And this is my tail end and this is my working end. So to start, grab your US 5 needle, and for the very first stitch, some of you might be familiar with using a slip knot, or you just simply start, but this one we want to give it a little extra loops. So we're going to actually put our needle in this way and loop it around just to give it a kind of a wrap, and that's actually going to be our first stitch. But you also want to make sure that the yarn coming from your thumb is on the left side of that wrap. Okay, so that's important because the next stitch you don't want to unravel what you just did. Okay, so this is our first stitch. It's kind of, we're going to call this our knit stitch. We're going to cast on stitches, a knit stitch, a purl stitch, a knit stitch, purl stitch, just like a ribbing is, to produce this look for this cast on. So this is our first stitch, our knit stitch. The next stitch is going to be a purl stitch cast on, and to do that we're going to bring our needle to the opposite side of the yarn coming from our forefinger. Bring it around here, up through the middle, and then down through this yarn under the other yarn as well. Okay, so that's the purl. Now we're going to do that similar motion for the knit stitch, the next cast on, but instead we're going to start with the yarn from our thumb. So we're going to go over our thumb yarn, up through the center, around both threads and out, and that produces our knit stitch. So you can kind of see the little difference. This is a knit stitch with no bump. This one is a purl stitch. There's a little bump you can see there, and a knit stitch. So that's how you can kind of distinguish between the two. So the next one is our purl stitch, and again we're going to go through to our forefinger for the purl, up in here, around both of them, purl. Next is a knit stitch around the thumb, up through the center, underneath both yarns. forefinger up through the center, around both yarns. Okay, so that is the pattern that we're going to continue to do, knit and purl, alternating as we go till we have an even number of stitches. We're going to end with a purl stitch. So let me just do a few more. Okay, so you notice that my last stitch is just actually wrapped on here. If I let go of my hand here, this is all going to come unraveled, so we don't want to do that. So to prepare us to do the very first setup row knitting, is we're going to make sure that we turn our needle counterclockwise, so it kind of just twists that last stitch on that needle one more time to secure it a little bit. Okay, so now I've got, I can leave my tail out in front, I've got my working yarn in back, and now we are ready to begin knitting our very first setup row. Okay, so let's take another US size 5 needle. Our very first setup row is going to consist of a knit stitch, then a slip stitch purlwise with yarn in front, and a knit stitch. Okay, so let's talk about each of those. Now if you notice, this first stitch I'm calling a knit stitch that I'm going to knit. If you see, you can recognize that that is really actually mounted on the needle the wrong way. It's backwards. It's mounted going from the front left to the back right. We actually need it to be mounted the other way for a regular knit stitch. But that's okay, because to fix that, what we do is we knit in the back loop. That's going to fix that orientation on the needle for this first round. So our first stitch is going to be knit through the back loop of the knit stitch. That's again a little loose stitch, so kind of keep that tight and taut. The next stitch is a purl, and we're going to, with the yarn in front, slip that stitch as if to purl. Just slip it with the yarn in front off the needle. Then put your yarn back in the back and knit that next stitch through the back loop. And then yarn in front, slip that purlwise. Okay, so we're going to do that for across the row for our very first setup row. Last couple stitches that knit through the back loop, and then the last stitch I just like to do a regular purl. Don't slip it, just do a purl stitch, and that just kind of secures in place that last stitch. Okay, so that is our first setup row. Still doesn't look much, looks a little messy, but hang in there, it's going to look a lot better in just a moment. So now we're going to turn the work, and we're going to knit another setup row. Okay, so we're not actually knitting our regular ribbing yet. We'll be doing that in a moment, but we're going to do one more setup row, and now we're going to just do a regular same thing, knit and then that slip stitch. But you can see now that our knit stitches are correctly orientated on the needle, so we no longer need to knit through the back loop. We can knit regularly through the front loop. So let's do a knit stitch. Again, bring the yarn in front, slip as if to purl, and a knit. So similar, but just now we're knitting in the front instead of the back loop. And then the last stitch, again, I'm just going to do a regular purl stitch instead of a slip. All right, it's getting there. We're getting a little bit more volume there. So at this point, we can now switch to our larger needles and continue doing just a regular 1x1 ribbing. So I'm going to switch to my US size 7 needle at 2 sizes up, and now we're done with the setup rows, and now I can continue with a regular ribbing. Okay, so now we're going to do a regular knit stitch. That again, I'm using my larger needle now. Knit, and we're no longer slipping. Now we're going to actually purl the next stitch. Knit and purl. So now we're just going to continue with our regular ribbing with the larger needle. So let me do this for a few rows so you can kind of see how this is taking shape, because those first few rows, it's a little harder to see the actual effect of that cast on. So I will show you that in just a minute, and then we're going to look at how to do this in the round, which I said is very similar, just has a very few slight differences. Now that I've knitted a few more rows of just a regular 1x1 ribbing, knitting one, purling one, you can see that it's really taking shape here. The ribbing is just flowing over that edge. It's a beautiful edge to any of your knitting projects. Okay, so that's how to do it in the flat. Let's take a look at how to do this stitch in the round. So to do this cast on in the round, it is very similar to doing it straight, as I just showed you. There are very few differences. It's going to start out the exact same way. But what I'm going to also show you at the end is how to fix one little problem when you do this in the round with this cast on. And I'll show you here. You end up with this funny little gap in your cast on edge that we don't like to see. So very simple to fix. We're just going to show you, I'm going to show you how to just kind of fix that with your tail. Add a little grafting stitch in there and you will be all set. You won't be able to see that. So I'll show you how to fix that as well. But let's start by using this in the round. I did in the round with circular needles here, but I'm going to show you how to do it in the round with DPNs just to save a little bit on time. Again, we're going to start casting on with a size smaller needle, US size 5, and then we're going to switch to the US size 7 for the rest of the project. We're going to start with a long tail, similar as before. And doing our setup just like we did before. This is no change from earlier. So we're going to set up our hand like this. We're going to start with a little loop. There we go. With the yarn from the thumb on the left side. And now we're going to continue to cast on purl, knit, purl, knit, purl, knit. And we're going to, let's see, let's cast on 24 stitches. You're going to want to cast on an even number for the 1x1 rib. So let's do that and then I will come back. Okay, after I've casted on these 24 stitches, now we're going to actually turn our work counterclockwise again to kind of twist that stitch on there so it secures it. But we are still going to knit the first 2 setup rows flat. We are not going to join in the round yet. We're going to do that after we do the first 2 setup rows. And the reason for that is these stitches are kind of hanging on here very precariously. They're just kind of looped around. There's nothing real secure hanging on to those. So it'll be very easy to accidentally twist these stitches if we start to join in the round right away. So we're going to first give it a little bit more stability, give it a little bit more meat to the bones, and then we're going to join in the round, and that'll make it a little bit easier. So let's do our first setup rows, knitting through the back loop for the first stitch, yarn in front, purl or slip that stitch purlwise, knit through the back loop, slip purlwise with yarn in front, and let's do that through the end of this row. And then that last stitch, we are going to again just do a regular purl stitch, not slip it, just to give it a little stability there at the end. Okay, so that's row 1 setup row. Row 2 setup is just like before. Again, we're going to knit, no longer in the back loop, in the front loop now, knit, slip with yarn in front, knit, and we'll continue that to the end of this row. And again, purl that last stitch. Okay, so now our 2 row setup is complete that we've done, knitting them flat. Now we can start to do it in the round. All right, to join in the round, we're now going to just switch to our larger DPNs, our US size 7, and now we're going to transfer these stitches onto 3 of the larger DPN stitches. So since I've casted on 24 stitches, I'm going to put 8 stitches on each of my needles. So I'm just going to manually just transfer them one by one, just slipping them from one needle to the next. I don't want to start nearly knitting with those because I want to join in the round first. So let's get these stitches to our DPNs, our larger ones. Okay, so now we can join to work in the round. So when you're working with double pointed needles and joining the round, you want to first make sure that your stitches are not twisted. So I like to lay it on a firm surface, put them in like a triangle format here, and then now we've got enough meat on these bones here to make sure that our stitches aren't twisted, and so making sure that that cast on edge is in the center of our triangle, and now we can successfully, without fear of twisting our stitches, begin to work in the round. So now we're going to take our 4th needle, our working yarn here, and we will join. So now we can continue or join in the round and do now a regular knit and purl 1 sequence. No slipping stitches anymore, just knitting 1, purling 1, knitting, purling, and we're going to now be successfully knitting in the round. So again, I'm going to do just a few rows of these so you can kind of see how it's shaping up within the round and how it looks, and then I'm going to talk about how to fix that nasty little gap that you see when you do this in the round. All right, I've knitted in the round a few more rows so we can still see how this beautiful ribbing stitch looks with this Italian tubular cast on. It's just a lovely finish where it just wraps around the edge. But as I mentioned before, this results in this funny little gap in your cast on, and you probably of course do not want that. We want everything to be nice and smooth around, and the reason there is a gap, of course, is that we knitted the first two rows flat and then we joined in the round. So we have a little gap here where we knitted flat and then we joined up on that third row, so that creates this 2-row gap here, and we can easily close that up using our tail. So let's show you how to do that. Just thread the tail onto a tapestry needle, and now let's take a look. We've got our tail coming off on the right side of this gap, and we want to close the gap by looking at this very first row of knit stitches and putting our needle through those V stitches. See the V's? I'm going to mirror here up above. I'm going to slip my tapestry needle through that knit stitch. And now we're going to take a look at this little bump, this little purl bump right here. Let's go through that purl bump. Then we're going to actually go back through that same V knit stitch, through those, that same one we did just a moment ago. Pull it through that, and then we're going to cross that gap again and go through the V knit stitch on the other side of the gap. And pull it through there. See? So now you can absolutely not see it. So while you have your yarn on your needle, might as well just flip it over and weave in that end, then snip it off, and you're all set. Now you can do this at any time. You could close this gap, while you're still knitting, or wait till you're finished with the project and then close it out. So there you have it, some beautiful ways, either flat or round, to use this Italian tubular cast on to create this beautiful flowing over rib stitch to make a very neat edge to your knitting. So I hope you give it a try. Do something a little bit unique with your ribbing. If so, let me know how you do and in the comments below. If you like what you see in this video, don't forget to subscribe, click the notification button, and then you'll get notifications of new videos I post all about knitting tips and stitches and creative patterns. So thanks for watching, everyone. Happy knitting.